the very latest on the border right now, the crisis and a standoff over the use of razor wire.
Texas Governor Greg Abbott has sent a letter letting President Joe Biden know that he is going to ignore the Supreme Court order that gave federal authorities the right to cut the barbed wire at the border that was intervening in the federal authorities' ability, the Border Patrol ability to access migrants and people crossing the border. That was the nature of the Supreme Court decision. Greg Abbott sent a letter outlining his legal and moral justification for ignoring the order from President Joe Biden.
Today, new video shows even more razor wire being put in along a contested section of the U.S.-Mexico border. This is happening even after the Supreme Court on Monday voted to let federal Border Patrol agents remove all of that wire. The razor wire was installed as part of Texas Governor Greg Abbott's security initiative at the border known as Operation Lone Star. The Biden administration arguing now the razor wire prevents Border Patrol agents from doing their job. In a new statement, I want to share it with you this afternoon from the governor's desk. He says he's declared an invasion and invoking the state's constitutional authority to defend and protect itself, and it supersedes any federal statute.
In the context, in the peanut gallery of this conversation, you have conservatives of every stripe calling for a confrontation between federal authorities and the Texas National Guard. They're calling for Greg Abbott to use the National Guard to do exactly what you see them doing, which is to defy the order from the Supreme Court, or rather the decision from the Supreme Court. And in reaction to it, they are anticipating, they being conservatives, are anticipating a confrontation with federal authorities. Why, you may ask, would conservatives be interested in having a confrontation between the state of Texas National Guard and federal authorities? Well, because they have had wet dreams and a fetish for a second civil war, quite frankly, since they lost the first Civil War. There are these little moments in history that could seem rather innocuous. I hope that as you see this order or this letter from Greg Abbott, that you don't let it just slide by you as something innocuous. And we'll put the letter on the screen and I'll deconstruct it a bit more so that you can understand his arguments. But what Greg Abbott has done is laid the legal groundwork for a confrontation between the state of Texas and its National Guard and federal authorities. You have voices on both sides of the equation now calling for what would be tantamount to a confrontation. Now, let's be clear. When I say confrontation in this regard, we are speaking of kinetic action. We're speaking of the very real possibility of the inflamed emotions of this situation at the border, as inflamed by Greg Abbott, who had every intention of inflaming the situation even more because it helps Greg Abbott score political points. It helps him force a constitutional crisis. It helps him posture as if he is the hero of the story, and Texas is a victim of the big bad wolf of the federal government who isn't protecting them from this immigration crisis. And I put that in quotations because, well, there's a good argument against whether or not Greg Abbott's legal justification, considering this an invasion, is even viable. Okay, so the underlying arguments from Greg Abbott, they are fallacious, to be certain. He presents this as a false dichotomy between the federal government either doing what he says at the border, right, or that represents an abandonment of the state of Texas. So he creates this false dichotomy through the entire. So these are things that we expect from conservatives, from Republicans. We expect this disingenuous argument, this disingenuous logic, and this disingenuous framing. Here's the thing, folks. We've been so used to them doing this over the years that we don't see the inflection point. Right now, a governor of one of the largest states in the union with the history of secession has now laid the legal and moral justification, albeit I want to be clear. What he has in the letter is neither logically consistent nor is it morally consistent, and it's not constitutionally consistent. As I will, I don't know, later, I guess I'll play or either drop a video later on. I use artificial intelligence to deconstruct the letter very quickly and deconstruct it on every level, from the logical framing, which we found multiple fallacies, right? From the constitutional framing, it Greg Abbott's justification and use of the Constitution to justify the state of Texas taking action against the decision of the Supreme Court doesn't even line up constitutionally. And then obviously on moral grounds, right? He's trying to frame this as a moral way of protecting the state of Texas. Here are why each of those positions important. Because if he can create a legal justification, a so-called constitutional justification, which, you know, doesn't stand the test of credulity, legal, constitutional, logical, and moral framing, then he's given conservatives every box that they need to check to say, okay, it's time for a civil war. Perhaps you think I'm being hyperbolic, and there it was on the screen, and I'll, you know, perhaps read it for you in a second, but you can get all the details. You can find the PDF on online everywhere to see his logical framing. It does not line up logically. It does not line up constitutionally, and it's every bit of false dichotomies and to colloquies, all kind of things that fallacies that you come to expect with Republicans.